John's gospel does not ease us into Christmas. There's no manger, no angels, no shepherds wandering around wondering if they ate something strange for dinner. John starts at full cosmic volume. In the beginning was the Word. Before there was a beginning to begin, before light and darkness had their first argument, before anyone needed grace, there was the Word. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. It's the kind of opening that makes you sit up a little straighter, like you're pretty sure you're going to be tested on this later. And John keeps going, piling up these big things, beautiful ideas: light, life, creation, truth, glory. It's poetic and majestic, and also just a little intimidating. I mean, if Matthew and Luke are telling the Christmas story with a warm lamp and a rocking chair, John is turning on stadium lights and asking us to consider the meaning of existence. And yet, right in the middle of all that cosmic poetry, John gives us a line that is tender, personal, and incredibly practical. From his fullness, we have all received grace upon grace. Now, that line is doing a lot of work. It's easy to miss because it doesn't sound flashy. No lightning bolts, no choirs of angels, just grace. And then more grace. And then, apparently, more grace after that. Grace stacked on grace. Grace piled high. Grace that keeps coming even when you're fairly certain you've used up your share. To talk about fullness, John wants us to imagine abundance, not scarcity. Not a careful measuring cup of divine favor, not a ration book where God checks to see if you've exceeded your monthly allotment of forgiveness. Fullness is the opposite of running on empty. It's the opposite of that feeling we all know when the gas light comes on and we start doing mental math about how far we can really go. The fullness John is talking about is more like standing under a waterfall and realizing that no matter how long you stay there, it's not going to run dry. And from that fullness, John says, we have all received. Not some of us, not the spiritually impressive, not the people who managed to get it right this week, all of us, which is both comforting and a little uncomfortable because it means grace is not a reward, it's a gift. And most of us would prefer to earn at least a little of what we receive. We like a punch card. We like progress bars. We like to know we've contributed something meaningful to the outcome. And grace refuses to work that way. Grace upon grace is a phrase that sounds lovely, but it's also kind of strange. Why not just say lots of grace? Why the repetition? Well, the sense in the Greek is not that grace replaces grace, as if the old grace wears out and God has to swap in a new version. It's grace building on grace, one gift resting on top of another gift. Grace that keeps meeting us again and again in new moments, in new failures, and in new fears. Grace that shows up Monday morning just as faithfully as it did on Sunday. Grace that does not say, I already helped you with that once. And that matters. Because most of us live as though grace is fragile. We live as though there's a limit and we are constantly in danger of crossing it. We imagine God watching us with a raised eyebrow. I wish I could do that. Tapping on a clipboard, muttering, we've been over this. But John's claim is far more generous than that. Grace is not God's reluctant concession. It is the natural overflow of who God is. It pours out of God's fullness because God is full. And John, he makes this even clearer when he contrasts Moses and Jesus. The law indeed was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. Now, that's not a knock on Moses. The law was a gift. It gave structure, identity, and direction. But the law could only show people what life with God should look like. Grace actually brings them into it. The law could diagnose the problem. Grace provides the healing. The law could point toward holiness. Grace comes close enough to touch it. And this is where John drops the most shocking line of the whole prologue. The Word became flesh and lived among us. Or more literally, pitched his tent among us. God did not shout grace from a distance. God moved into the neighborhood. God took on skin and bone and a nervous system. God learned hunger, fatigue, and the unique frustration of trying to explain something important to people who keep missing the point. The fullness of God did not remain safely in heaven. It showed up in a human life. Which means that grace is not abstract. It's not an idea. It's not a slogan stitched on a pillow. Grace has a face. Grace has a voice. Grace gets tired and sits down by a well. Grace weeps at gravesides. Grace eats with people who make everyone else uncomfortable. Grace touches the unclean and somehow makes them whole instead of becoming unclean itself. Grace upon grace is not theoretical, it's personal. You know, there's also a quiet humor in the way grace works, if we're paying attention. Grace tends to show up precisely where we're most sure it shouldn't. It meets us in the moments when we're rehearsing our apologies, preparing our excuses, bracing ourselves for disappointment. Grace interrupts those speeches. Grace says, you can put that away. I already know. It's the divine equivalent of showing up to a potluck empty-handed and discovering that not only is there plenty of food, but someone made your favorite dish. Living as though grace is real is harder than it sounds. It requires us to stop pretending we are self-sufficient. It asks us to receive instead of achieve, and it invites us to extend the same grace to others, which is often where things get complicated. Grace is wonderful when it's for us. It gets trickier when it's for the people who have hurt us. annoyed us, disappointed us, or simply disagreed with us. Grace upon grace means God is not done being generous, even when we would very much like God to stop. John ends the prologue by saying that no one has ever seen God, but the only Son, who is close to the Father's heart, has made God known. Grace is how God is made known. Not through force, not through fear, not through constant disappointment, through grace layered upon grace, gift after gift, mercy that keeps finding us. So when we hear that line, from his fullness we have all received grace upon grace, it's not just a theological statement. It's an invitation. An invitation to stop living as though we're running on fumes. An invitation to trust that God's supply is deeper than our own need. An invitation to believe that even now, even here, there is more grace coming than we can possibly use up. And maybe that's the best news of all. Because tomorrow will come with its own challenges, its own mistakes, its own moments when we wonder how we ended up right back here again. And when it does, the promise of John's gospel is not that we will finally get it right. The promise is that from Christ's fullness, we will receive again grace upon grace. Amen.